If we take the height of Mount Everest, we would still have about a mile of water above us before we get to the ocean's surface.
Spend a lot of time and effort developing submarine hunting technology.
Nearly 7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific, in a place where sunlight has never once touched the seafloor, a small metal sphere sat motionless in the mud. Inside it, a single pilot waited while a camera bolted to the hull, switched on, and began recording. What that camera captured over the following hours would not just document a record-breaking dive. It would quietly dismantle a belief that scientists had held onto for more than a century. The idea that the deepest parts of the ocean were essentially empty, a frozen wasteland where nothing could survive for long. Instead, the footage showed a floor crawling with life, more of it, and stranger versions of it, than almost anyone studying the deep sea had expected to find. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to understand exactly where this camera was. The location is called Challenger Deep, a narrow slot at the southern end of the Mariana Trench in the western Pacific, and it holds the title of the lowest point on the surface of the entire planet. If you took Mount Everest and lowered it into that trench, its summit would still sit more than a kilometer underwater. The pressure down there is difficult to describe in a way that actually means anything, because numbers like 8 tons per square inch don't translate easily into felt experience. The simplest way to say it is this: a small failure in a submersible's hull at that depth would not injure a person. It would kill them instantly, before their brain even had time to register that something had gone wrong. The dive that produced this footage took place in 2019 as part of an expedition led by explorer Victor Vescovo, whose goal was to personally visit the deepest point of every ocean on Earth. His submersible, custom-built to withstand pressures that would crush most deep-sea vehicles, descended for nearly 4 hours before it finally touched down on the floor of Challenger Deep. Vescovo was not the only person paying close attention to what happened next. Back on the surface ship, marine biologist Alan Jameson, who had spent much of his career studying the least explored layer of the ocean, watched the incoming video feed with the kind of attention that comes from years of low expectations. He had built his career around the idea that the deep trenches deserved serious scientific study, even while many of his peers treated them as a curiosity rather than a real ecosystem worth investigating. What came through on those screens surprised him. The scientific consensus going into that dive was cautious optimism at best. If life existed at all in the deepest trenches, it would likely be sparse, isolated organisms scattered thinly across a mostly barren landscape. That was the expectation shaped by more than a century of deep-sea research, going back to the earliest dredging expeditions of the 1800s, when scientists lowered nets and equipment into the deep ocean and pulled up little more than mud and the occasional simple organism. That scarcity became the story people told about the deep sea. Even in 1960, when Jacques Picard and Don Walsh became the first humans to reach Challenger Deep aboard the bathyscaphe Trieste, and reported seeing signs of life through their tiny viewport, the era's primitive cameras couldn't produce footage clear enough to convince a skeptical scientific community. The idea of a mostly lifeless deep ocean held on for another 2 decades, only beginning to crack in the late 1970s, when researchers discovered hydrothermal vents crowded with thriving colonies of creatures that got their energy not from sunlight, but from chemical reactions in the vent water itself. That discovery, called chemosynthesis, proved that life didn't need the sun to survive. But those vent communities lived at depths of around 20,000 to 25,000 feet. Nobody had good evidence for what, if anything, lived at the true bottom of the trenches, several miles deeper still. That gap is exactly what Vescovo's 2019 footage filled in, and it filled it in dramatically. Rather than the sparse, scattered life scientists were braced for, the cameras showed the seafloor practically busy with activity. Within moments of a bait canister settling into the mud, swarms of amphipods, small shrimp-like scavengers, converged on it in numbers dense enough to look less like individual animals and more like a shifting, living cloud in the water. Sea cucumbers moved across the sediment with the same unhurried confidence you'd see in their shallow water relatives, grazing for food with no apparent distress. There was no sign of creatures barely clinging to survival. What the footage showed instead looked like ordinary animal behavior in an ordinary habitat, except that habitat happened to be one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The deeper Jameson and his colleagues studied the recordings, the more the picture shifted from surprising to genuinely puzzling. This wasn't a single hardy species eking out an isolated existence. There were multiple types of amphipods, some built for speed, others adapted for staying close to the seafloor. There were different varieties of sea cucumbers, worms, and isopods, each apparently occupying its own niche in a food web that clearly involved scavengers, filter feeders, and predators all interacting with one another. A structured, functioning ecosystem like that doesn't appear overnight. It takes generations, likely a very long stretch of evolutionary time, for a community to divide up roles and specialize the way this one clearly had. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If this ecosystem has been quietly running for thousands or millions of years, then the empty deep ocean idea wasn't just an incomplete theory. It was a complete misreading of a functioning, ancient system that had simply never been observed properly. Then there was the matter of energy. Every animal on that seafloor needs something to eat, and normally the two sources scientists point to are marine snow, the slow rain of dead organic material drifting down from the sunlit surface layers, and chemosynthetic bacteria near hydrothermal vents. But researchers calculating how much marine snow actually reaches these extreme depths have consistently found the numbers too small to support an ecosystem as dense and active as the one caught on camera. And there aren't confirmed hydrothermal vents scattered throughout every stretch of the trench to make up the difference. That leaves a genuine unanswered question sitting at the center of this discovery. What exactly is feeding all of this life? Some researchers suspect the deep trench environment might simply be far more efficient at recycling nutrients than anyone assumed, wasting almost nothing and stretching what little organic material arrives much further than expected. Others suspect there are energy pathways down there that haven't been identified yet. Either way, scientists are looking at thriving, high-definition footage of an ecosystem they cannot fully explain the fuel source for. Beyond the sheer abundance and organization of the ecosystem, one specific animal stood out enough to become the symbol of this entire expedition. A species of snailfish, drifting through the camera's beam with a soft, almost translucent, jelly-like body between 8 and 10 inches long. Everything about conventional deep-sea biology suggested an animal like that shouldn't exist at those depths intact. Soft tissue and delicate structures are supposed to be the first things crushed under 1,000 atmosphere pressure. Instead, the snailfish moved through the water with the same ease you'd expect from a fish in a shallow coastal pool, fully formed, fins working normally, apparently unbothered by conditions that would instantly destroy a rigid, air-filled human body. The trick, it turns out, lies less in brute toughness and more in chemistry. Because these animals are built almost entirely of water and soft tissue, with no significant air pockets to compress. The pressure inside their bodies stays nearly matched to the pressure pressing in from outside. Nothing gets crushed because nothing rigid is fighting back against the crush. At a cellular level, their proteins are structured to hold their shape under pressures that would unfold and destroy ordinary proteins. And their cell membranes contain fats that stay flexible in conditions that would otherwise stiffen them into uselessness. It isn't alien biology. It's the same basic biological toolkit every animal on Earth uses, adjusted in a handful of precise places to tolerate the extreme. What makes this discovery unsettling rather than simply fascinating is how much it exposes about the limits of what we've actually observed. The lights on a deep-sea submersible illuminate only a small bubble of water, a few meters across at most, and the Mariana Trench stretches for well over 1,000 miles along the seafloor. Every hour of footage humanity has ever collected from that depth amounts to a handful of narrow glimpses scattered across an almost entirely unexplored expanse. In several recordings from the expedition, researchers noted movement at the very edge of the light, sediment disturbed as though something had passed through just outside the camera's reach, vanishing the instant it might have come into frame. Nobody is claiming there's clear evidence of an undiscovered giant lurking in the trench. But the automatic dismissal that used to accompany any unusual sonar reading or unexplained shape near the deep seafloor, the assumption that nothing capable of producing it could possibly live down there, doesn't hold up anymore. If 8-inch amphipods and improbably large snailfish are thriving in plain view, the honest scientific position is that we simply don't know what the upper size limit looks like for animals adapted to that depth, or how many of them have ever passed close enough to one of our brief, narrow lights to be seen at all. Perhaps the most sobering discovery from the entire expedition wasn't biological at all. When the submersible settled onto the floor of Challenger Deep, the lights picked out a plastic bag resting in the sediment, along with other recognizable debris, sitting at the deepest point human instruments have ever reached. Later analysis of amphipods collected from the trench found microplastic particles inside their bodies, meaning pollution generated on the surface had not only sunk nearly 7 miles down, it had already worked its way into the tissue of animals that scientists hadn't even finished cataloging. Humanity confirmed this ecosystem existed in 2019. By the time we saw it clearly, our waste had already been there for who knows how long. Taken together, the footage forces a genuine reassessment, not of one detail, but of the entire framework scientists used to think about the deep ocean. For more than 100 years, the working assumption was that life effectively stopped somewhere below the reach of sunlight, that the deepest trenches were essentially dead zones, interrupted by the occasional resilient straggler. What the cameras actually found was a crowded, organized, energetic ecosystem operating on rules we still don't fully understand, hiding an unresolved mystery about where its energy comes from, and holding evidence that human pollution reached it before human science did. The old idea of an empty deep sea wasn't a small miscalculation. It was a story built entirely on the absence of evidence, mistaken for evidence of absence. And the unsettling part isn't just what the lights revealed. It's the growing suspicion among the very scientists who study this place that we've barely begun to see it at all.